We are Life Church Livonia.
So we're in a series called How to Neighbor, and it all flows out of one passage in Luke chapter 10 and an interaction that Jesus has with an expert in the law. And so this guy who's an expert in the Jewish law approaches him, and he's really trying to trap Jesus and to question him and to kind of poke him into saying something that they then can latch onto and give Jesus a bunch of grief about. But instead, Jesus turns it around and asks him questions in return, because that's how Jesus does. And so he comes and he says to Jesus, "Tell me how I can inherit eternal life." And Jesus says, "Well, you've read the law, you've read the Bible, you've read what God says. What do you think it says?" And so Luke chapter 10, verse 27, the expert in the law answers, and this is how he answers. He says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." And so over the last few weeks, what we've been doing is we've been talking about what does it look like to love your neighbor as yourself. That last line, that it was kind of an addendum to, a tag on to the kind of the main story that this man was trying to tell, is the actual aspect of this guy's answer that Jesus latches onto. Jesus, the rest of it, he just says, "You nailed it. You nailed it. That's exactly right. This is what you need to do to find life." But then, because the guy won't let it go, Jesus goes on to tell a story about how we love our neighbors well that kind of changes everything for us. And so we've been talking about, what does it look like for us to be a good neighbor? Why was it so important to Jesus that we do it really well? And so we've talked about racial reconciliation a few weeks ago. Last week we talked about embracing orphans. And this week we're going to talk about what it looks like to love the lonely. We're going to spend the whole morning talking about loneliness. And so what I want you to do before we go any further is to kind of get in your mind, what type of person do you think of when you think of the lonely? Is it the elderly? Is it the people who are kind of the socially awkward? Is it the people that are kind of the outcasts of society? Who comes to mind when you think of lonely people? And what I want to tell you today is that no matter who came to mind just now, that you need to expand that, broaden it, deepen it. Because the lonely in our culture, the lonely in America, are everywhere. They're everywhere, including in this room with us right now. There's a new phrase that's being used by sociologists in the United States. And these are the people that kind of study people. And they study culture, and they study how we interact with one another. And the phrase that they use regularly now is two words: relational poverty. Relational poverty. And we all know what poverty means when we're talking about finances. It means that you don't have what it takes in terms of income to meet your basic needs. And relational poverty is a little bit different, because relational poverty, it occurs when people lack the intimacy and connections that they desperately need to live a meaningful life. Relational poverty is when you don't have enough intimacy. You don't have enough relationships with other people to actually live the kind of life that God designed you to live. And what sociologists in America would say is that we have an epidemic of relational poverty in the United States. And this epidemic of relational poverty has created an epidemic of loneliness amongst us. It's a massive problem, but it's not a new problem. In fact, some people would say that our very culture is designed to create this issue. We can go all the way back to 1970 to a book called The Pursuit of Loneliness. It was written by a guy named Philip Slater. Listen to what he said in 1970. His words are incredibly prophetic. He says, "We seek a private house, a private means of transportation, a private garden, a private laundry, self-service stores, and do-it-yourself skills of every kind. An enormous technology seems to have set itself the task of making it unnecessary for one human being ever to ask anything of another in the course of going about his daily business. Even within the family, Americans are unique in their feelings that each member should have a separate room and even a separate telephone, which in that day would have been absurd, right? Even a separate telephone, television, and car when economically possible. We seek more and more privacy and feel more and more alienated and alone when we get it. Philip Slater, 1970. So I'm in my middle age now. I wasn't even born when he wrote that book. I was born just a few years later. And Philip Slater believed that we were unintentionally creating an entire cultural system that was perfectly designed to make people more independent and therefore more alone, more lonely. But the problem is that we weren't created for independence. We weren't created to be alone. And in fact, if you go all the way back to the creation story in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, and we see God making the heavens and the earth, and every time he would create something, he would say, it's good. And then he made humans, and he said, it's very good. The only time in the entire creation story when God declares something to not be good, the only time he looks out on creation, he says, that's not okay, is found in Genesis 2, verse 8. And it says this: the Lord God said, it is not good for man to be alone. All of creation amazing. Everything God made incredible. And then he looks out and he sees this guy all alone and he says, that's not good. I didn't make him to be alone. We were made for relationships. It's woven into our very DNA that we need to be connected and interconnected with other human beings. It's part of how God literally hardwired us. And now, flash forward millennium later, and we see now today that there's become a clear consensus, even amongst medical professionals, that our ability to be connected socially affects us medically. That we were made to be connected with one another. People who are more socially connected have better health. It's just true. All the research supports it. Socially connected people live longer. They respond better to stress. They have more robust immune systems. And they even do a better job of fighting off very specific illnesses. All based on how socially interconnected we are. God made us that way. And despite all of these heaps of data, all of this, everything we know to be true about how important it is to be connected, we are more disconnected today than we've ever been in the history of humankind. I love what doctors Olds and Swartz say in one of the recent books on loneliness. They say this: a group headed by a researcher from Duke University found that between 1985 and 2004, the number of people with whom the average American discussed important matters dropped from 3 to 2. Even more stunning, the number of people who said there was no one with whom they discussed important matters tripled. In 2004, individuals without a single confidant now made up nearly a quarter of those surveyed. That was in 2004. Now, our country is filled with them. Filled with people who say they don't have a single person they can talk to about important matters. Our culture filled with people that don't have a single friend, a single neighbor that is loving them and that they're loving in return. This is a crisis. And it's a crisis that we have to be willing to address because we live in a culture filled with lonely people who need us to love them as our neighbor, to love our neighbor as ourselves, just the way that this man said when he had this interaction with Jesus 2,000 years ago. And Jesus said, yeah, that's it right there. That's important. It's critical. And yet here we sit, many of us in this room, in a place where we are the lonely person. Well, we are the person that's described here. You're the kind of individual that has people all around you, but you don't feel like there's really anyone that actually cares about you. You have people all around you, but you don't feel like you have anyone you can open up to. That you have people surrounding you maybe all the time, it feels like, but you don't feel like there's anyone that you can actually trust. Maybe you're sitting here today and you are the lonely person. And one of the things that loneliness does to us is it not only isolates us emotionally, but it isolates us cognitively. We begin to think differently. We begin to think that we are the only one like us, that we are the only lonely person. It's just not true. You're surrounded by them. You're surrounded by people who are lonely. You're surrounded by people that could sit in a crowded room and feel all alone. You're surrounded by people that are stay-at-home moms that are surrounded by children. They're never alone, and yet they feel completely alone. You're surrounded by people who work with a ton of people, and yet they don't have a single close friend. You know people who are college students who live in a dorm and never have a moment of privacy because they're constantly with people, and yet they feel completely isolated. You probably know successful business leaders that seem to have a huge social network. They have more connections on LinkedIn than you could possibly imagine, and yet they, at the top of their game, don't have anyone. We have an epidemic of loneliness. You could be in the midst of a marriage, and it could be dysfunctional enough that even in the midst of that marriage, this husband or this wife that you see every single day, you still feel all alone. And the problem is this, is that the deeper we slide into our loneliness, the more we struggle with the consequences of our loneliness, and the further we sink into our own coping mechanisms. The coping mechanisms that we use to fight it off, to stave off these feelings that we hate, a feeling alone, a feeling isolated. And so as we slide into these coping mechanisms, we end up working too much. We end up gorging ourselves on TV and other types of film and media. We begin to observe the lives of other people on social media without actually engaging life ourselves. And none of it cures the loneliness. None of it. All it does is defer the loneliness. It pauses it until a later time. It pauses it until the movie is done playing. It pauses it until we've reached the bottom of our Instagram feed and we're now seeing the same things we saw yesterday. It pauses it until we lay in bed at night and it becomes quiet again. So our coping mechanisms, all they do is defer the loneliness. And here comes Jesus saying, church, I want you to love your neighbor as yourself. Church, if we did this, if the church in America did this, loved our neighbor as ourself, we could end relational poverty. The church in America could end relational poverty if we lived into the call of loving our neighbor as ourself. But the reality is that we are terrible at being neighbors. And not only are we not very good at being a neighbor, but we honestly don't want to have neighbors. Because it requires us to open up. It requires us to be vulnerable. It requires us to be real. It requires us to let people into our homes when they're messy and into our lives when they're messy. And so we struggle with this. But God calls us to love the lonely. So how do we do it? How do we love the lonely? The very first thing I think that God calls us to do is to stop and pray. To stop and pray and say, God, give me eyes to see. Eyes to see that the people around me who are hurting, the people who are struggling, the people who feel all alone, and not only to give me eyes to see, God, but I want to have a heart that cares. Because it's not enough to simply see it. Now we got to take a next step and do something about it. Lord, help me to see it and then to be able to have the compassion to do something about it. Because I believe that God is calling us, the church, to be the solution to other people's loneliness. God is calling you and God is calling me to be the solution to other people's loneliness. And some of you are sitting here today and you're thinking, well, what about me? I'm the lonely person. I'm the one who's struggling. I'm the one who needs to be loved. I am the neighbor who doesn't have anyone. And I would still say to you that God is calling you to be the solution to other people's loneliness, because I believe that when you become the solution to other people's loneliness, you find the solution to yours. You find the solution to yours. You sit in this space and you long for people to reach out to you, but you struggle to even want to reach out to others. You long for the neighbor to drop by, but you've never dropped by. When you become the solution to other people's loneliness, you begin to find the solution to yours, because you get out of yourself. You get out of this place where we get stuck, where it's all about me and all about my struggles and all about my difficulties and all about my needs. which those kind of thoughts and that way of thinking actually isolates us even more. God made us to be connected. He designed us to be together because it's not good that we were alone. So we pray, God, bring someone to mind, someone who I can neighbor well, someone who I can love well. Lord, maybe it's someone 3 or 4 seats away from me today, behind me or beside me. Lord, give me eyes to see and then a heart that will respond. God, maybe it's someone at my office, the person at my office that seems like no one really even knows them. Lord, what if it's actually my own teenage child? How can I see that and respond to it? God, give me eyes to see the people. And then once God has brought that person to mind, we're called to love them like Jesus loved. And I get it. Jesus is not us. He's perfect. He's the Son of God. He is everything that we long to be. But he also called us to be like him. He called us to follow in his footsteps and to love people the way that he loved people. And so I just want to walk us through. After we go through that moment where we say, Jesus, show me someone I can love, then I want to walk us through how Jesus did it. And so we have a model to base our life on. And I want to look at 3 ways that he was really intentional about loving the lonely during his ministry. And I want to start today by talking about the way that Jesus loved with touch. And before your minds get all crazy, this is not what you think it is. Jesus loved with touch. And I'm going to show you the way he did it. And then I think it should break our heart and change our hearts. Matthew 8:2. A man with leprosy came and knelt before Jesus and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Listen, the guy didn't say, can you make me clean? He made a statement. He said, Lord, I see you. And I know you can do it. You can make me clean. And leprosy in this day and age could have been a whole host of different skin ailments and different issues. They didn't have the medical technology we have to differentiate between one type of skin ailment and another. So everyone that appeared to have leprosy was considered a leper. And if you actually had leprosy, true blue leprosy, this was an awful and still is an awful disease that, if left untreated, leads to a painful death. It's an incredibly difficult struggle for these people. It starts with pain, with fatigue and pain in the joints. It moves on to different scaly spots that start to develop all over your body. People's faces change shape. Their voice changes as it attacks their vocal cords. Their body begins to rot on them. Imagine what that smells like. Imagine how deep of a struggle. Imagine if you have this disease and you're living in Jesus' day and age when no one knew what caused it. And in the Jewish culture, if you had leprosy, you were considered unclean and therefore no one could touch you. No one was allowed to touch you, despite the fact that we know now, medically, that leprosy is actually hard to contract. It'd be really rare for you to touch someone with leprosy and actually catch leprosy. You have to be in really close contact with them on a regular basis to actually catch it. It's not very catchy. But they didn't know that. So if you had leprosy, you were unclean and no one would touch you. You were forbidden to touch anyone. In fact, you would have to go through town. If you moved from one end of town to another, you would have to scream out the whole time you're walking down the street, unclean, unclean. And you screamed this out because you didn't want anyone to touch you and no one wanted to touch you. Imagine how isolating that would have been. Here's a man coming to Jesus saying, I know you can clean me. I know you can heal me, Jesus. I desperately need this. A man who is isolated and alone and desperate. And Jesus stops. And look at what he does. The next verse. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately, he was cleansed of his leprosy. Think about this. Did Jesus have to touch him? Absolutely not. Read the New Testament. How many times does Jesus do a miracle or heal someone without even coming near them? How many times did Jesus do something incredible, extraordinary? There were moments when someone would come to him and say, hey, someone in my family member, someone in my household needs to be healed. And he would say, it's done. And the person was like, wait, why don't you come with me? And Jesus is like, no, it's done. Go home, and when you get home, you'll see that it's already done. He didn't need to touch people. Well, he raised someone from the dead without even entering the tomb. His friend Lazarus, they rolled the stone back. And they're like, Lord, you don't want us to roll the stone back because he's going to smell. And he's like, roll it back. And then he calls him out and he says, Lazarus, come out. He didn't even go near him, and he did it. And here's this leper, a person that no one had touched maybe for years, who comes to Jesus to be healed of his leprosy, of his disease. And Jesus, on purpose, reaches out and touches this man and says, I'm willing. What was he willing? He was willing to risk the ridicule of his community. He was willing to risk everyone else saying, now you're unclean. He was willing to risk the social ostracism that would come from doing this act. He was willing to risk it all because this man needed love. He didn't just need to be healed from his disease. He needed to be healed from his loneliness, from his isolation. He needed the love of touch to transform something in him. A pastor friend of mine told a story about how when he was a teenager, he got a job actually as a cashier. He was a cashier at a grocery store. He took his job really seriously, and he was a believer, and he thought, man, I'm going to use my job as a cashier to make everyone's day better. I wish that I had that cashier at the grocery store, okay? And so this guy, he was into it. And it was a fairly small community, so he had regular customers, and there was this one lady named Ruth. And she would come once a week, usually on Thursday at 4:30 p.m. And she would come, and she would always stand in his checkout line. And as he began to get to know Ruth, when he would hand her change back to her, he would put the money in her hand. Then he would leave his hand on hers just for a moment and say, Ruth, I hope you have an amazing day. And then she would leave. Day after day, week after week, month after month, couple of years go by, and Ruth is still coming to his checkout line, only his checkout line. Even if she came and there was a brand new line that opened up, like, sometimes you'll get a long line, and this guy's name was Chris, and if Chris's line was really long, another cashier would come up and say, hey, I can take you over here. She would stubbornly stay in Chris's checkout line. And so finally he says to her, he says, Ruth, why is it that even if there's a shorter line elsewhere, you always stay in mine? And she begins to cry. And she says, every week, I go through my entire week without any human contact at all, except with you. You're the only person who sees me. You're the only person who touches me, ever. I'll stand in your line every week for that. Jesus loved with touch when it was appropriate, when it was needed, when it was part of the healing. This doesn't mean that we're going to become a church that invades everyone's private space. Absolutely not. We will not be that church. Some of you are like, if we become a church that loves with touch, I'm out. I'm gone. Because we've heard about what happens in churches when people do this inappropriately. We've read the headlines. We've seen the stuff that makes our skin crawl. We will not and never have been and never will be that church. But we will be the church that steps in and gives the hug when it's welcomed. We will be the church that gently lays a hand on someone's shoulder when it's appropriate, when it's welcome, when it's needed. Jesus loved with touch, and sometimes we need to as well. Sometimes we need to as well. I'll even ask, if someone comes to me and wants to be prayed for, I'll even say, would it be okay if I touched you, if I put my hand on your shoulder? And you wouldn't believe the impact of this. It's transformative. But not only did Jesus love by touch, Jesus loved by listening. Jesus loved by listening. And honestly, most people don't listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. We've talked about listening before, and we're going to talk about it over and over again because of how important it is. So I want to jump into a story in Luke chapter 25. It's just after Jesus' death. Everyone that had followed him thought, man, it's over. Like, everything we gave up our lives for is done. All of his close disciples, they were like, we thought he was the Messiah, and now he's dead. They didn't know that he had risen yet. And so in this encounter, actually Jesus walking alongside of them on this road, and they have no idea it's Jesus. We don't know exactly why they didn't know it was Jesus. Maybe he looked different. We don't know, but we know that they didn't recognize him. And he's walking alongside of these people that are super depressed and super lonely and super isolated. And this is what happens, Luke 25. Jesus asked them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? And they stood still, their faces downcast. And one of them, named Cleopas, asked him, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? And Jesus says, what things? Did Jesus know what the things that they were struggling with were? He was what they were struggling with. He was the cause. His death was he was the one that had just been beaten and bruised and bloodied and hung on a cross until he died. He was the reason they were downcast. And he's walking alongside of them knowing exactly what they were discussing. And he says, what are you guys talking about? And they're like, seriously, dude? Where have you been? And Jesus is like, what things? Tell me. I want to hear from you. I want to listen to you. Eventually they figure out who it is, and it's this incredible moment. But Jesus listened. Friends, we need to focus more on being interested in people than on being interesting to people. So many times we engage in a conversation where, especially if we're nervous about it, we're worried about like planning in advance what we're going to talk about. Think about first dates when you're like, well, what are we going to talk about? What if the conversation gets awkward? What if there's a pause? How am I going to fill that space and appear to be interesting? We need to be more focused on being interested in other people than on being interesting ourselves. And one of the best tools we can have, if we're going to love our neighbor well, is we have to learn to ask questions. Jesus was the master of this. And it's part of how we love our neighbor well. Tell me your story. What a great question. People will be like, well, what do you mean my story? I don't even know what part of my story. It throws people off because no one's ever asked them that. No, I just would love to hear about you. Tell me your story and let them fill the space. And when there's a pause, don't feel like you have to jump in. You can just say, man, I'd love to hear more. Tell me more about that. I'd love to hear more. How can I pray for you? I'd love to pray for you. Tell me, is there anything I can lift up before God? These are questions that pull something out of people. And they're questions that we can ask even if we think we already know the answers. Jesus did it all the time. He knew all the answers. He could have just responded with the answer, but instead he drew it out of them. Recently, someone asked to meet with me. It's no one that goes to this church, and they had reached out and they said, I have a ton of questions. They're really wrestling with some questions in their life. Things that they wanted answers to. And they sent me a bunch of questions in advance and all these things that they wanted to talk about, and all these things that they wanted me to resolve. And I said, sure, I'll meet with you. Knowing in my head that there was no way I was going to be able to resolve all the questions that this individual had. And so we met. And this person who had all these questions that he wanted answers to, we met for a little over an hour, and he talked for 55 minutes, at least. I maybe gave 3 answers to him during that entire time, and they were usually like 1 or 2 sentence answers. And he left feeling so heard. It was incredible. At the end of the time, he said, man, thank you so much for answering my questions. And I was like, dang, I didn't answer anything. Killed it, right? That was the easiest test I ever took. And then he sent me a follow-up text and said, man, the answers you gave me to my questions really helped me a lot. And I'm like, dang, the Lord is good to me because I did nothing. Sometimes people don't want you to solve their problem. They just want to be heard. He didn't need me to solve this. He already knew the answers. But he didn't know that anyone cared about him. And me listening, loving with my ability to listen, loved like Jesus, and it was me loving my neighbor. People just want to know you care about them. Jesus loved with touch. He loved through listening. And he loved with time. This one's hard for us. Jesus was always going somewhere, but was never in too much of a hurry to stop and attend to the people that were around him. He was always going somewhere, but he was never in too much of a hurry to stop and engage. Even if it was just for a few moments to listen and help people to be seen. How long did that interaction between him and the leper take? 5 minutes? Maybe not even that. It was so quick. This guy comes up and says, Jesus, I know that if you're willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus is like, hey, I'm willing, be clean. That's done. And that guy walked away transformed because Jesus stopped what he was doing and engaged. We see it over and over again in his ministry. I could read all these different scriptures to you, but I just want to highlight a few. When he was speaking to a crowd in Luke chapter 5, he gets interrupted and he stops what he's doing. In the middle of a sermon, it'd be as if someone walked in the door right now with something that was causing them distress, and I stopped my sermon and attended to them and then went right back into my sermon. That's what Jesus did. When he was asleep at one point, don't mess with my sleep, people, okay? But Jesus was like, no, I'm cool, wake me up. Luke chapter 8, it happens, and he attends to the need. On his way to perform a healing, on his way to actually meet someone's need, we see another time in Luke chapter 8 that he also pauses and he gives his time to someone. When he was praying, he's getting his much needed alone time himself when he's praying, and he gets interrupted in Mark chapter 1. And he attends to that person and he gives them time and he loves them. Friends, at the end of our lives, none of us will say, I wish that I had worked more. Or I wish that I had watched more movies. None of us will get to the end of our lives and say, man, if only I'd spent more time on Facebook. or if only I'd broken the 1,000 likes barrier on Instagram. None of us will say that. What will we say? What do people regularly say at the end of their lives? They say, I wish I had spent way more time loving the people that God put in my life. My family, my friends, my neighbors. The expert in the law comes before Jesus and says, how do I inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, what does it say? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, nailed it. Do that and you will live. We can't impact everyone, but we can impact someone. And I believe that the church is called to step up and step in and be the solution to other people's loneliness. And in so doing, we find the solution to ours. Because it's not good for humans to be alone. God didn't make you that way. So what if you're still sitting here? What if you're still saying, what if I feel alone? What if it's me right now today? I want you to know that this church, these people, this pastor cares about you, that we love you. I'm never going to do this perfect, by the way, as your pastor. I'm never going to know the exact perfect moment when someone needs a hug. I'm never going to ask all the perfect questions and listen exactly the way Jesus. I don't always kill it the way I did with that one guy I met with this past few weeks. I won't always be the best steward of my time, and we won't always be, because we're human and we're fallible, but we're going to do our best. We see you, we love you, we care about you, and so does God. God cares about you, God loves you, and with God you are never alone. Isaiah 41:10 says, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand, my strong right hand. Do not fear, I am with you. This is our God. And this is the invitation to all of us to draw near to the one whose love is perfect, even as we draw near to the ones around us whose love will always be imperfect. I want to extend that invitation to each of you today, to draw near to God. To draw near to God, who has the power to give you everything that you need, including the community that you're missing. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we worship you in this place. Just so grateful that you modeled for us exactly what it looks like to love our neighbor well. to love with appropriate touch, to love with our ears by listening well, to love with our time by allowing you to be the one that sets our agenda. And Jesus, in this place, I know that there are people who are desperately lonely, who are struggling, who are far from you, God. The ones who not only don't have any people in their life, they don't have you in their life. And so if that's you today and you're in this space right now praying with me, I just invite you to say, God, I am tired of doing life alone. I'm ready to do life with you. I need you to draw near to me. I need you to uphold me with your strength and to help me with your kindness. I need your love and your grace, God. I choose you. Jesus, I ask that you would become a part of my life, that you would cleanse me of all the things that I've done, all the ways that I've tried to do it on my own. Jesus, I pray that you would help me to know that you are real, that you are God, and to learn to live my life in relationship with you and your people. I commit myself to you. Jesus, we love you. And we thank you in advance for what you're going to do in and through us today, God. In and through us this week, in and through us this year. And we pray these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.